Okay. Could all the panel members please turn on their faces? Charles, are you there? Friedemann.
Yeah, I'm here.
Und dein Gesicht. And Ronnie, could you turn on your face too? Friedemann? Good. Okay. And Eva has come up here. There is no agenda for this, but you have a homework assignment, and I wonder who wants to take it up first, which is to explain to the people that are not here what it is that was at issue, not the specific content, what was at issue in this series of linguistic talks about things like function words, intonation contours, and so on, and how it's related to the question that is the main theme of this summer school, which is what is it? How is it that what is it that LLMs learn, and what is it that they understand and don't understand? It doesn't to the naive attender of this summer school seem obvious how the baby phonology is relevant to this, although it was. In fact, maybe that's the burden on you, Judith. Can you justify asking people who work with word bags, large language models, to think about intonation contours?
Right. Okay. So essentially, I think the question is whether we intend these models to be relevant for language. And if so, like how humans understand, produce, learn, generate language. And if so, then learning is, of course, a crucial thing in that these models are built and they need to be trained, and they need to be trained massively. So it's not like they're built and then they know language. They are built and then trained. So training, that is learning, is a crucial aspect in these models. It, of course, is one for humans, right? So taking a larger perspective, humans, the human brain takes about 25 years to mature. It's an organ that takes the longest to actually reach adult maturity. And we are relatively unique among primates or other animals in having a really long development. And so essentially, learning is crucial to who we are. So essentially, one question, the way I see it is, if we want to understand whether large language models are relevant for our understanding of the human mind or human language, then since learning is an important component of both of them, it makes sense for me to try and see whether there's a parallel between how infants learn language and between how these models learn language. Now, how infants learn language has a lot of components. So I think throughout the day, Eva, Virginia, myself have evoked lots of things which are minor details in themselves, but they make up the kind of mechanisms, biases, representations, whatever, that infants use and bring to the task. So intonational contours, of course, we can and should define each of these, but say intonational contours or the determiners or whatever you can think of are just pieces in this puzzle. And so we each brought a certain piece that we think from our perspective, because we are looking at 2-year-olds who are starting to produce, or newborns who have certain prenatal experience, or children, young children, toddlers who are growing a vocabulary, use and rely on these things. And so to me, what's relevant here is that as far as we know, large language models only do one thing. They accumulate data, compute statistics over lots of data. Whereas we brought evidence that infants rely on certain aspects of the sounds or the sound patterns of language, distributional evidence, maybe conceptual knowledge, lots of other things. And so I guess whether we understand specifically intonational phrase or not,
Okay.
but rather there's a whole set of things that do models do that? If yes, what does that mean?
Your sound is
How?
coming in and out. Are you all right?
Yeah, sorry about that. But so
Don't-
essentially that I'm done. So
Okay, Eva is burning to say something.
Yeah, no, I think so. Maybe a place to kind of help also start this conversation is to first kind of highlight what large language models do in terms of learning. So if learning is so important, how is it exactly that they're learning and versus like what we currently know about people? So for what we know of open source models and the little we know of closed source models, right? Language models learn using also now a combination of strategies, but usually the principal one is next word prediction, right? Where they're getting large amounts of text and they're needing to predict always the next word based either on just previous context, or some models have also following context. And now more recently, we then combine that with reinforcement learning using humans in the loop, where we're trying to then give models information in the form of rewards for responses that human raters say are better than others say. So that can be another form of information that they get. And now finally, I think the newest models now also have access to like grounding in images, for example. And most likely those models are using, I think you mentioned Virginia, the work by Fong and Al. These models are probably using an additional sort of learning mechanism that has to do with contrastive learning, where they're sort of comparing the information between utterances and images to other utterances and images and which one best matches. And so that's currently sort of the picture we have for how these models are learning, right? They learn through next word prediction, through contrastive learning, and through reinforcement with rewards for based on human judgment criteria.
But fair enough.
Yeah.
But so what you said made sense, and what Judith said made sense. But what Judith, what you said could have been just as well justified inviting a swimming instructor to this conference, because they also teach something. Why should we be particularly interested in the learning of language other than the learning of the lexicon and perhaps of the grammar directly? And I think that's the entry point. Does anybody want to take that up?
can I just add one single thing, and then I'll let essentially why I should have said this after Virginia's talk, but I think one important or kind of interesting entry point into the discussion or the comparison is, let's say, next word prediction. So if you're a model that predicts the next word, then you should not have a one-word stage. That's it, right? And babies do. And so we could sort of start with very basic things like that, I think.
Anybody? Okay, go ahead, Charles.
I think one of the differences between learning language and learning swimming, I mean, there are many. One is that in swimming you get correction. In language learning, you generally don't. And also, there may be the range of linguistic forms across languages are really quite astonishing. Although the statements for universality or from typological considerations may have been overstated, there is a great variety of linguistic forms out there across languages. That's the challenge that those of us working on language face. And not to mention the problem that everybody is aware of, that is that we don't learn language through that many words or through many iterations and so on. So there are some important differences between language learning and learning swimming. And also, of course, humans learn languages. I don't think you can teach a bird to swim. And so there are some biological capacity limitations as well. So it's not there is something special about language, even though it may not have been as special as we thought 60 years ago.
So you've been told that it's learning.
Yeah.
And that's one of the justifications for looking at that's one of the justifications. But what does that tell you? I mean, large language models are learning things about and with words. How does we agree that swimming doesn't penetrate words, but how can you make it more explicit? Because I know the answer to this. Make it more explicit from the linguist's point of view, how the issues about phonology and about functional words, how those functional words are functional words, so never mind. But intonation, which is behaving like a functional word, how those enter into what should be the concerns of people who are working on large language models.
Let me take a example of phonology, right? In American English and including Canadian English, we have this intervocalic flapping. So when you say pad padding and pad padding, if you speak this right of English and even though they're two different forms and you add ing, the T and D come out as a flap, which if you do experiments, humans cannot just discriminate which phoneme, namely T or D, is coming from, right? So this is one of many examples when we're learning a language, we're taking the surface data because we can only hear the surface data, and they reconstruct some more abstract representation out of it. This goes all the way from phonology to morphology to syntax, right? So that's what we mean by linguistic knowledge. And so, I'm not saying large language model can't do this or can't do that. This is the kind of question of how humans unravel this, backward mapping is what we study. And I think at least apparently, it poses some interesting challenges, especially considering how early children learn these, at least gradually, more and more abstract linguistic knowledge, as in Virginia was talking about earlier, for determiners and so on. Kids seem to get it very early on. She also said we have some disagreements over how that comes about, but there's something to be explained there.
Virginia, and then Judith. I didn't see what order the hands went up. Virginia, and then Judith.
First, actually.
Pardon me? Judith.
Yeah, so maybe just a very brief comment on the words, right? So one issue to begin with, of course, is words are not there in speech, right? So words are artifacts of our writing systems, mostly, in a certain sense, right? There is no linguistically valid definition of what counts as a word. And speakers do have some intuition, but of course it's not very clear, at least for certain situations. So essentially, this is clearly not what a baby would do. They don't just accumulate words. That is quite obvious, right? So as much as predicting the next word or predicting something that's coming up is something that humans and even young children can do, definitely the units on which they operate do not correspond to written words as we know them. That's quite obvious.
Did you want to follow right after, or are you changing the subject?
I'm changing the subject.
Okay, then let's stick a little bit with Judith. One of the earliest of these models was Terry Sejnowski's and Steve Hansen's. You want to say a few words about that, because they were in fact isolating words from speech and not from writing.
Well, I was mostly going to comment on, I totally agree that the way we speak, we don't necessarily see word boundaries as the specific symbolic units we start from. But I think in some sense also, I'm going to play a bit devil's advocate in this panel, given the representation that's here, that a lot of models we now have also have the ability to sort of represent smaller and smaller units, right? So they're not necessarily, I said next word prediction, but they do this on the character level. And, you did mention in your talk that written characters are themselves also an abstraction, right? And I do agree with that. And so maybe it's at this point, we have models that are encoding a bias from the start, an innate bias in terms of like their abstract phonological categories that they have access to. And so we have to at least acknowledge that that is a bias that our models have. And so, yeah, right now, they start from there and they're totally skipping the steps that you talked about in your talk, in terms of how they even get to those categories. I think what's interesting is sort of asking the question whether or not that the learning process that may come beforehand ends up influencing other levels of representation. So your choices in terms of your phonological categories, does that end up affecting your choices then in terms of like morphological units that make sense, in terms of your syntactic categories that make sense, semantic categories, and so on. So given that these are all sort of different levels of abstractions that in the end all are dimensions of, one sort of linguistic signal that we're getting, they have to be connected in some ways and have to sort of cause different learning biases in one way or another to each of those levels. And personally, I think that models may actually be a really interesting place for us to start kind of exploring those effects and like the relationship that may exist actually between these different levels of representation in an interesting way. Whether that's like actually just with existing large language models, I'm not convinced, but I think that the idea of using these sort of neural network type architectures and the right type of data and looking at these questions may be an interesting way where we can start kind of like studying these sort of emergent learning bias behaviors that sort of go over these different levels of representation.
Okay, Virginia, time for you.
I'm going to respond to what I think was your initial question, Stephen, about basically why do we care about language learning? And I think we care in part because it's the most successful kind of learning that we know of. It happens earlier and more broadly than any other kind of learning that we know about. And it involves multiple systems, both multiple linguistic systems and multiple cognitive systems. And understanding how that works is, on the face of it, I think something one wants to do. It's a separate question to me what the role of large language models is in that, because I don't think that's the goal of large language models. So it could be the goal of some people who use large language models to look at different problems. And Eva, I think that's what you were doing in your talk. But people who develop large language models aren't actually trying to understand language acquisition. That's not their goal. So a question I'm interested in is is there any intellectual rapprochement, or is the only reasonable way that people working on language acquisition would make use of large language models is by trying out different hypotheses? So, for example, I'd like to see different models of how categories are acquired and what kind of information do you need to put into the system to get the kind of behavior that children are displaying very early. And what's the range of models? So I know there are a lot of different large language models, and you isolated 3 different types. Within each of those types, there are a lot of different varieties. But if we're talking about acquisition, then I think we do want to talk about what's cognitively plausible if we're actually going to try to model what children learn and how they learn it. And no model that we know about right now is cognitively plausible. But maybe that's not the goal of people who work on large language models, and that's okay with me. But then I don't think that they can say, all languages is one word after another. So for me, there's a discontinuity between the methods and the results and the claims, the philosophical claims about what those results show. And I think, Ronnie, I don't want to speak for you, but I think that that's the kind of argument that you're making as well.
Yes, very much so. I think that these models are of course very impressive in terms of engineering, but to make any kind of connection to cognition, one would need to somehow find some way in which these models are good explanations for some things, some interesting things that we know about human linguistic cognition, and I don't think that has been that has been done. I don't know if, in fact, of a single attempt to engage with the arguments. So, and by now there are like maybe 70 years of arguments about key aspects of human linguistic cognition, and of course many centuries, maybe a couple of millennia of less formal reasoning about human linguistic cognition, and the LLM literature that talks about the LLMs in cognition doesn't try to make the case that LLMs improve our understanding of any of these key aspects, or even that they're close contenders. I think when we try to think about the architectural properties of language, and there are all kinds of basic distinctions that we know that we have even before we get to learning. Just about an hour ago, Virginia was showing us making the case for resource limitations in children and how they affect the utterance length. Humans have all kinds of restrictions of this kind. We don't know of any way in which these LLMs can have anything similar. The kinds of things that make us struggle with center embedding, but then get better at it when we sit in a quiet room or think for a bit longer. None of that. The things that make us able to tell that something is correct, even though it's unlikely, these LLMs don't have that kind of distinction at all. They only talk about what's likely. That's the only thing they can output. Technically, that's the only thing we get. So correct is simply not a thing for them. And then, of course, representations and learning, which are kind of central to everything that we're talking about here. And they seem to be so different in terms, they are a representation, a framework for representation. So I think when people sometimes talk about these LLMs being an alternative to universal grammar, that I think that's, I understand what people mean when they say that, but it's incorrect in the sense that they are a universal grammar. They're a hypothesis about universal grammar, just a very different one from what linguists and psychologists have proposed for many decades. They are a proposal about what universal grammar is, a framework for representing hypotheses, representing knowledge, into which we can, or something can acquire knowledge. But they just seem to be completely, first of all, completely different from everything that linguists and psychologists have proposed, and also they seem to be completely inadequate as theories of universal grammar. They are theories of universal grammar, just the wrong ones. And in terms of learning, they learn in a particular way. I think that talking about next word prediction is, which is of course correct, that doesn't narrow things down enough because you can imagine lots of different mechanisms for learning through next word prediction. But these networks, and all networks for 40 years now, have been learning when they learn and become language models, now large language models, before that early smaller ones, they learn with a particular way of preferring certain hypotheses over others. And their preference is to match as much as the data as they can. They try to minimize a certain quantity, which is an expression of the fit to the data, sometimes with a little bit of adjustment around it.
Eva is ready to.
That one can show that one doesn't generalize. You just try to memorize as much as possible, which is what these networks do. And one can show that this prevents networks from acquiring even much simpler things than natural language. And yeah, so I'm puzzled as to why. And I mean, I think it's, you know, again, the engineering work that went into these models is very impressive. I'm still not understanding why people think that that they might be serious models for human linguistic cognition. So
Okay, question posed. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you know, I agree with a lot of the points that you're making, and it's true that maybe when we talk about LLMs, we're talking about these really large language models, right? And maybe their learning environment seems completely unrealistic given the amounts of data they see and possibly their, you know, the lack of natural communication that in terms of the environment in which they learn. But I disagree with the point that we haven't really been sort of thinking, at least with language models, regular language models, in recent years about how they could be useful in terms of answering questions about human cognition. I think there is actually a lot of more recent work in the last sort of, I'm gonna say 4 years, that has been kind of trying to address this question. And you're right that it's an important question. And really what has been missing is like a real conversation about how to do this properly without, you know, how do we, and that's sort of, hopefully, that was a bit the topic of my talk, which was, you know, how do you do this if you can't make the commitments that we used to have to cognitive realism? How do you then go about sort of using these models in interesting ways that can help us answer these cognitive questions? And I think people have been thinking about that and trying to find ways to do that. In terms of large language models and these models that, you know, clearly have a learning environment that is very different from our own, I, to a certain extent, agree with you that it's very difficult to see them as possibly useful for questions on language acquisition per se. They seem to more be a measure of, you know, like collective cognition or intelligence, since they're trained on huge amounts of data across many different people and cultures and so on. But language models themselves, so the sort of simpler version of this that made me think of the types of models that we had in like the Baby LM challenge, for example, are whether these models can be useful, I think is, I would say, yes, they can be, and they can help us in different ways to answer these questions. Maybe not as directly as more traditional cognitive models allowed us to do, but they do still definitely have their place in helping us think about human cognition, coming up with, you know, novel hypotheses about how we might be representing information, learning biases that allow us to learn new information. And so, yeah, that would be my position, at least. Agree on some things, disagree on others.
Your talk was very ecumenical, whether you realize it or not. You made an assumption about something that's very divisive, actually, that's very divided, let's say. And now I'm playing devil's advocate.
Okay.
It used to be the case that people who worked with computers in some sense, in connection with capacities that are in some sense cognitive, called their discipline artificial intelligence. And it was contrasted with another discipline, which you call cognitive realism. It's really cognitive modeling, okay? It wasn't the same discipline. You can say it in baby talk. The ones who are doing AI, we're talking about what we could do, what machines could do, and what algorithms could do, period. And what use we could get out of them. And the people who are doing cognitive modeling were interested in what people can do or and other organisms and how. And these are two different agendas. Now, here it's being treated as if it were the same agenda. And there are people who are puzzled about why large language models do various things, because they say this is not what people do, and therefore, why are you asking the question? Well, it can still be asked. And now I'm really going to be the devil's advocate. Prepare yourself, Ronnie, because I'll need you for this as well. One of the conclusions that the people who are doing large language modeling and not noticing that they're not doing cognitive modeling or imagining they're doing cognitive modeling is to conclude, and I'm going to caricature it, but that the 50 years of linguistic research that we've had has been on the wrong route because it has come to the conclusion that certain things are, watch my lips, unlearnable, that are learnable. And the fact that it's proved that they're learnable because it's proved by large language models. Now, this sounds like a good argument to those who work on large language models, but this is not a good argument for people who are doing this 50 years. And do you want to take over at this point, Ronnie?
Sure. So I think that some people outside of linguistics do believe that linguists think that things cannot be learned in principle, and that's why we need to be born with a very rich UG. Again, everyone agrees that we have UG, whether they know it or not. But some people think that linguists think that we have a very rich and restricted UG because it's impossible to learn things, and that's just and then LLMs refute that, or so the story goes. Now that's simply not true. I mean, some people have beliefs about some things being very hard to learn and so on, but that's by no means a consensus view. And quite a few linguists actually believe that in principle you can learn a lot. And I certainly believe that it's possible to learn a lot. And I think that we can, as scientists, we can infer a lot from what we learn from in very particular settings. We can set up all kinds of experiments or arguments from the poverty of the stimulus are very informative, or can be in principle, and other arguments concerning learning. But it's not that it's impossible to learn in general, and it's not that when you have some kind of model that's very successful in learning all kinds of things that refutes something in linguistics. In fact, I can't think of anything that would refute. The arguments are different.
Yes, I think if one wanted to really play devil's advocate, and if we don't have a real deep language modeler now here in the discussion round, but I could imagine that within this camp, this AI camp, there may be people who would strongly claim that large language models have actually falsified the claim that a UG is necessary, a universal grammar, as postulated by Chomsky, is necessary at all for generating sentences. And if one goes a little bit further, one could even extend this to saying that it's not necessary for language competence, and that would be a rather radical claim in the context of current linguistics. So maybe we should discuss the possibility of maintaining this argument, because that's of really great relevance, as Stephen suggested initially. We should focus, we might want to focus, at least in part today, on the really strong claim, on the really fundamental things we could address with our humble linguistic data.
That's the eye of the storm and you hit it. And Ronnie, when you answer, don't be wishy-washy. Aim it at the eye of the storm. Don't talk about ecumenical climate.
but first maybe Friedman, would you mind explaining a bit more what you think that the that LLMs would show us in this case, or whether
well you can give the chat GPT or God knows which version of a deep language model, you can give it a sentence fragment or just a single word, and it creates step by step additional words that fit to the start, and finally you will end up with sentences and very few non-sentences. So in that sense, it's a sentence production machine, sentence generator, and there's no evidence whatsoever that anybody put into this machine any knowledge, any a priori knowledge about linguistic structure. So it is indeed true that here, based on empirical data from large corpora, we have a machine that generates the correct English sentences, at least. Not sure about rare languages for which there is not a big corpus available, but for English seems to work quite well. Or am I wrong? Correct me, please, if I'm
not wrong, but you're too easily impressed. I mean, these kind of models have been around for decades.
I am not impressed at all. I'm the devil's advocate. Yeah, but the devil might be impressed, yeah.
Right, you know, you can try and train an Ingram model, and we used to teach this on smaller corpora. You can make sentences that seem fairly reasonable. The other thing is that, you know, I think Ronnie has a paper on this, and many others, right? So the claims that these models have achieved certain kind of syntactic ability are too weak. They're based on benchmarks that are way too weak, and that a lot of baseline models can trivially pass them. So it's not actually accurate to claim these things have reached the linguistic or syntactic capacity that linguists take for granted. I mean, I think Ronnie has a paper showing the supposed methods of learning, I think, WH movement, right? If you tweak the data just slightly, still very simple, the whole thing, you know, falls apart. And my students and I have done work showing the supposed benchmark to show various ability can be passed by Ingram models. It just said the rigor is just really low. I'm sorry, and you should not be impressed, you know, by this at all.
Right. So we could boil this. We could counter to this argument. No, ChatGPT is just a Markovian process, and it just so happens.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's Markovian. I'm not saying that.
But I think it's true.
I don't know how it works. I'm just saying that you should not be impressed by some claims as based on very rigorous data.
It's indeed so that the initial versions of GPTs, they used the context of 50 words, and more recently they went up to, one example was 4,000 words, and I think in the latest version it's a local context of 40,000 signs, so words.
What's the third last word I said?
Which means,
what was the third last word I said in my past sentence?
Please let me just continue with that. It means that we are looking at a K-limited neighborhood, but the K is extremely high, 40,000. So one could argue it's indeed so that the machine can generate whatever sentence you want. However, it's based on Markovian processes, as Ronnie pointed out. I think it was you yesterday, and or actually it came up in several talks, and therefore it's not impressive.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I agree with you, Charles, that a lot of the data that we're basing ourselves on, these benchmarks are sometimes very noisy. They don't necessarily measure exactly what we want them to measure. And in general, the field is moving so fast, that the quality of work is not always properly controlled. And it's, I also agree that the abilities of a large language model don't in themselves say anything about human abilities. And I think that's sort of the point that when people talk about these proofs of concepts, so there's like work by Bowman and Warstad on this, also by Lapkin on this. When we talk about these things, and also Marco Baroni talked about this, you need to, at the very least, in order to just say that this gives you any notion of what's possible in principle and people, that their learning environment of these models is either equivalent or somehow deprived in some way to that of the human learner. And we all agree that like a large language model, that's definitely not the case, right? Or at least in terms of its linguistic input, it's getting way more input. You could argue that it has a, you know, a harder learning environment in the sense that maybe it has less access to grounding and it doesn't have access to language in a social context. And as we've seen, like you get a lot of information that helps determine what you learn in a language, how you design your language based on the natural fact that language is for communication. So maybe that's an argument to say that these models have somehow an environment that makes learning harder. But the flip side of that is also to say that maybe actually children's environment is harder because they have so much input information. And so really it's about the first question I guess we should answer is what exactly are kids actually paying attention to when they're learning? So what input actually matters? And once we have that answer, then we can actually start thinking about whether or not these models can be good models for these types of proofs of concept.
Yeah, right. So so I think we do have some idea about what kids pay attention to. So and I think a lot of that is definitely not, you know, very structured full sentences where there are phonetic categories and words and all of that, right? So and so indeed I think there is like this kind of gap of, is it an issue that they learn from this, you know, from written text or not? And I don't think that's solved. There is a lot of, there is effort to go, of course, in the direction of large language models learning directly from sound, because of course, at the engineering level, it might not even be that hard. I mean, there are issues, obviously, but what I want to add to the discussion is the question of benchmarks. And I think in addition to what these models can do, I think we really should consider what they cannot. So as something that came up in Virginia's talk, is how the kinds of mistakes that babies or children or toddlers make and the kinds of limitations they have. And these models don't seem to have that. I think also Ronnie just mentioned that earlier. And I think it would be nice to see if, but of course we get sort of the final model, right? So whenever a new ChatGPT comes out, it's been trained, worked on, et cetera, So I think it really would be important to maybe with open source models that we have more access to actually look into the training and whether there is anything there that looks at all like initial limitations or lack of resources or whatever that we see in children. So to take this seriously and not just try and see whether once you have a fully trained model, what is it that it's able to do? Actually, in a certain sense, it's almost too good even for an adult, right? So many adults can't actually write that coherent paragraphs the way ChatGPT can. So that's one thing, but certainly this is not what children do. And so I think, I don't know what would be a child version of this, but somewhere in the training process, there has to be something that we could qualify as, well, that's the state at which it corresponds to, say, a 1-year-old or a 5-year-old to a 2-month-old. And then let's look at what it does.
Let me aim the challenge in another direction. In your talk, Eva, you spoke about the block world.
Mm-hmm.
And at other times you just spoke about grounding without being particular. Do you, I want to put it as if I don't believe it, even though I don't believe it, but do you really believe that toy worlds scale up?
Great question. I think from I mean, a scientific point of view, we've always in cognitive science worked from these sort of toy setups, right? Be it in experimental setups where we have toy languages, be it in early versions of these modeling approaches, we used, again, toy data in some way. And the nice thing about toy data is that in itself, it's kind of, you hope that it's sort of a model of the data that is actually being presented, right? Where it has controlled properties where you can sort of play around with it much more. It's for sure, if you use toy data, you are likely missing some of the aspects that are present in natural language that you just haven't accounted for. And so maybe in that case, you can't necessarily scale up for those particular factors. So maybe there's something about, the noisiness of natural language that is actually important to the types of systems we end up learning.
It's not just noisiness, and the word polymodal doesn't solve it either. It's not just that you're only looking at vision. What about hearing? What about smelling? What about tasting?
Yeah.
It is that it's true that humans are the only ones that talk. And I really think that they're the only ones who have language, but they're not the only ones that have the kinds of things that the distinctions that the linguists make between content words and function words. Content words refer to things, and animals know what those things are too. They can't tell you, they can't describe it, they can't define it,
Right.
but they can recognize it, and more important, they know what to do with it, and that's the real criterion of whether they know what it is. How do you scale? How do you even establish connection between a toy world and what those animals can do from bottom up?
I mean, I think using, generated data or toy world data, if you can design that data in a way to account for these types of things. Obviously, the block world gives you sort of very easy to recognize objects versus, if you were to see objects in a very noisy background. But maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but I do think that it's just that it's really using toy data is about controlling the factors that generate your data.
True, but what generates content words, I mean, pardon me, what generates the reference of content words is sensory motor function, like robotic function. And large language models are a big bag of words and wonderful algorithms to operate on. And it's true, and you'll say to me that when they're working on a toy world, they're not working with words, but they're using the same kinds of tricks, deep learning, etc. Do these together, in your view, scale up? That's what I mean by scale up. Or are they not the right stuff to begin with?
So let's take the example of the work I talked about where grounding was simply images. For sure, I'm not accounting for other parts of these sort of embodied experience of learning language, right? I don't have how you feel these objects, how you hear, how you touch these, how all these other factors are definitely important to language. We don't totally understand how. All this gives me is that it gives me another modality in which I can ground text.
What do you mean by ground?
So it gives me something I can map to. It gives me another space, a referential space in which I can create a mapping, right? So if we think of like meaning as an association of, some symbolic word, so like a word is just, it's a symbol, right? And we think of meaning as a mapping of that symbol to some other referential space. In my case, that
if I say I don't know what you mean, am I saying I don't have a mapping?
Yeah, you don't know what the thing maps to. Yeah, that's.
But I don't think wait, that's the way to describe it. But how many people actually feel that when I say I don't, let's say no, so who came in with Gavaga?
I did.
Yeah. So Gavaga, but we could have picked something from Hungarian.
Yeah.
Lélek. Okay. You don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Is all you mean by I don't know what that means is I'm missing a mapping, because mapping is ungrounded. It's just taking one thing and connecting it in some way to another thing. That's not grounding.
But
Can you ask the same question to the linguist? There's no grounding there as well.
They don't, it looks like they don't need it because they're looking at the real thing. They are not, there's no doubt that the 50-year program has got one handle on how it is that human beings don't produce certain utterances ever.
I agree with that, but you're bombarding Eva with questions about grounding, whereas, well, you should ask the same question about to the linguist. Is an artificial grammar grounded more than a GPT representation of language?
Virginia, you look like you want to say something.
Did people hear me or not?
It's a little different from this. I want to point your attention to the Q&A where there have been some interesting comments that are relevant to the discussion. And then I have some technical questions that I'll bring up after we finish this.
The point that I made when I was in the audience was just that Stephen was asking Eva about grounding, and of course the toy models that she uses are just minimal grounding and toy grounding, I could say. And I totally agree with Stephen that grounding should be sensory motor, but you guys' works that is linguistic, the works by linguists is no more grounded and it's no more sensory motor than what the large language models. So as Chomsky used to say, you know, if I don't, you know, you have the same problem as the other guys. So it's not an argument against the other guys. That's the only thing I was pointing.
They don't have a grounding problem. They're doing syntax.
Yeah, but
Those aren't words with reference.
at some point you have
Sorry,
to go. Yeah. Go ahead.
Can I jump in
Mhm.
about the grounding issue? So I wouldn't go as far as saying no grounding is needed, but it seems like, first of all, there's lots of linguistic contents, notions, semantics, whatever you want to call it, that we perfectly understand and learn without any grounding, right? Democracy has no grounding whatsoever in the sensory motor world, I mean. And sort of work by Lila Gleitman, Barbara Landau, and others have shown that actually you can have quite a lot of sensory deprivation. So blind children understand red in exactly the same way that seeing children understand red. And that's not, they never experienced red, but they, from language, there is enough contents that they can extract. And so they will say red is warm, red is the color of love, and all these things that a seeing person would associate with red. And of course, maybe it's not, you know, exactly 100% the same, but it's quite, and of course they see, they don't see, but they can touch, etc., etc. So of course, it's very hard to imagine what it would look like if there was absolutely no grounding. But I think you can get quite a lot of language with very limited grounding, both in a person who has no sensory deprivation, and of course, in cases of sensory deprivation that were looked at. So I don't see this as a major, how to say, constraint. So there certainly has to be some. We are in a physical world, in a physical body, but it doesn't seem like you need all that much.
So you make an argument for Eva here. I mean that you don't need that much grounding to actually get meaning, and that's an argument against Etienne.
Yeah. That's an argument against me, but
Well, yeah, you can. Let's start now if you want.
no, I don't want to. I don't want to. It's not my show. But what do you want to say? What is what Pierre said is correct. Do you want to answer him that as much grounding as you get out of your block word is some grounding, and that's all you need for what it is that you want to do with that? And what do you say to that?
Well, I would say that's as much grounding as we can do today. If we at some point manage to put to get robots that have sensory motor interactions with the world, and that we can manage to let them interact with their environment, and some point give them linguistic data to so that they can start learning a large language model. Maybe you'll have the kind of you don't agree with that because you talked about that, but maybe at some point they'll have more grounding than we can give with pictures. But nobody can do that today. So we'll have to wait to see how the technology evolves to see if we can do that. But to give it the kind of grounding that you would want, we would at least need to do that. That's something like a T3, and we would have to do that. Nobody has a T3 right now. We have T2s maybe with large language models, and that's it.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, yeah, so my perspective is as long as you have at least something, you have a form of grounding, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're learning the same meanings that a human experience would have, right? So it may be a very different set of mappings to that you or I have through how we have learned language. I think that's also true amongst each individual human being, right? And that's why we mentioned earlier, individual adaptation and individual variance have been topics that have come up a lot today. And so, yeah, so depending on the type of way you experience language, you end up with different groundings. And for sure, my model may have a very different experience, and maybe you're right. Maybe we can't then say that it scales to be representative of the human experience.
Is it any experience at all?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is a form of experience. It is a form of learning. But then
By experience, you just said learning. You said, I think it's a form of experience. I think it's a form of learning. I don't doubt it's learning.
yeah,
What do you mean by experience?
yeah, it's an experience in which I guess these models are learning a mapping system between symbols and some form of grounding in some kind.
You said it's a form of experience in which these things are
Yeah.
learning.
Yeah,
I don't doubt they're learning.
yeah,
I mean, this is a form of X in which they're learning. What is the X?
yeah. The experience in the particular example I gave, their experience is images and questions, right? It's
They're looking at images and they're
Yes.
experiencing something.
I think
maybe our definition of it.
here.
Yeah, maybe our
That's what I
definition of
think.
French
experience is different.
experience and experiment is the same thing. I think he wants you to talk about feelings or
What do you mean?
Oh,
by
yes,
experience?
no, they don't have feelings. I don't think
Okay,
they.
well, then-
No, I definitely not this model, whether or not, I don't think I'm gonna go out and say, I don't think a language model has feelings either. But and a language model that's just trained on language is another thing, right? Because we are not grounding in any other referential space. So I think it is still an open question whether or not these models can therefore understand or have a meaning representation, because they're just remapping to the same space, right? They're learning distributed representations for these words, and that's a different thing. And so, yes, that's
Here for. The trouble is that since you always substitute mapping for meaning, I'm not
Yes.
sure we're talking about the same thing.
Mhm.
Mapping is mapping and meaning is meaning.
Yeah.
Elkezdek figyelj ide, Judit, ha elkezdek beszélni magyarul ezek elől.
Jó.
Mi az az when I start doing that instead of English or French,
yeah,
does it mean anything?
it means nothing to me.
Okay, when
Yeah.
I'm talking like this, it does.
Yes.
What's the difference?
That I
A
know
mapping?
it's- Yeah,
Oh.
to a certain extent, yeah, I think so. It means because I have an experience, I've experienced these words in other contexts where I've then learned that these words are used in the presence of X information in those contexts. And that is the mapping that I've then made. I've created these sort of in terms of like computation, you can think of me as these sort of, these lexicons, right? Where we have these mappings of information to be a visual grounding. These lexicons could also include grammatical information, but they are in some sense, kind of like a dictionary.
And a
Yeah.
dictionary is a bag of words. And where's the meaning?
Well, some meaning comes from derivation, right? How we combine these words.
So those are sentences. Where does the meaning of that come from? In what does it consist? You want to answer? It's a mapping. It's another mapping.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a bit of a lexicalist.
So
Meaning that, yeah, I think it comes down to sort of these base units that we've created encodings for in some way that encode symbols to other information.
encodings are encodings. That means symbols, right? You have one set of symbols and you can map them literally
Yes.
into another set of symbols, but that's just symbols. The grounding problem is, how do you get out of that symbol to symbol circle?
Well, I don't know. I'm not necessarily convinced that the space we're mapping them into is symbols. It's a bunch of information across many different contexts, right? So it's sort of, it's more than just a symbol. It's a bunch of shared information that has, that comes from our experiences.
It certainly comes from your experiences.
Yeah.
The abstract representation that get built in a large language model, they're not symbols. They're spaces where different word will be closer to each other.
Spaces, I understand.
Yeah.
Culture, I understand.
Yeah.
But what's the grounding on that?
Oh, I'm outside of the grounding problem. I'm talking about the mapping problem now.
Oh, that's mapping. That's what you've done.
Mapping. So I think we go in a large language model, we go from words that are taken from text to very abstract I know you don't quite like the word abstract, to very abstract representations of that is spaces that contain semantic space that where words are closer or in Euclidean distance, closer or farther than each other and to each other, and from that we can map it back to, and it's not true that they just memorize, because they have to generalize. There's no way they could memorize the whole corpus. It's way too big, so they have to reduce their representation to something that's more compact. And from that compact representation, they can map back to words and create the sentences that Judith was saying that no human could do. They're much better than humans, but that Ronnie said that, and Charles said that they're so bad that they don't even pass any benchmark. So
We're in a summer school on cartography.
yeah, maybe there's a lot of mapping here.
Well, that's fine. We've left the plumbing. Yes.
And regarding feelings, we'll have someone in the next few days who will say that nobody can explain them. So it's very hard to say something about that.
Yes, he was talking about Dave Chalmers, but I'm not really talking about explaining it. I'm just talking about what it is. And what it isn't. Yes. But yes, Virginia, sorry to leave you out for so long. Go ahead.
That's fine. I wanted to get back to Nicaraguan Sign Language and home sign. That seems to me a real challenge for large language models. I don't know whether anyone here has anything to say about that. I can imagine saying, well, they don't really have language. They just have a superior communication system. But it appears that the Nicaraguan Sign Language cohorts successively refine the system and make it more language-like, even though they aren't getting good input. So does anybody have any idea why those phenomena are ignored by people who create large language models?
Yes, I totally agree that those phenomena are ignored in the current form of large language models, and I think that's because these phenomena at their heart are the result of the need to communicate with others, and language models don't have that same incentive or need in how they learn, right? So I think.
But when you put in reinforcement systems, isn't that doing what you're supposing is the case?
Yeah, it's a form,
here?
it's a form of it, but at least up until now, these reinforcement systems is sort of in an after the fact method. That is sort of there just to kind of make their responses sound more naturalistic, but not there for the purpose of learning language. So I agree, I do agree with you, Virginia, that actually I think maybe one of the directions that should be interesting in the future from, the modeler's perspective, those developing these models, if they do want to develop models that may be more data efficient and have more, possibly understanding that seems more like humans, maybe the answer in part lies in actually introducing this notion of languages for communication and should be done in sort of a social context, and that is currently really missing, at least for the main part of their training, the main part of their learning, and really the important part, which is the sort of initial part, right, where that's how we learn.
So would your argument be that people become more language-like, that is, their system becomes more like known languages because that's a more efficient way of communicating?
It's more than that. So I think they come up with these systems in the first place, so say generation 1 and so on, because they need to communicate. They want to have a way to talk to others. They want to have a way to make relationships with others, get what they need, get what they want. And so they have to find ways to communicate. So that's the first step. And after that, so the second generation, say we think about the Nicaraguan sign language cases, that's where we start to see these signs of like language compression, right? Where there it's no longer just about your individual needs to communicate, but it's more about sort of community's needs, right? Once we introduce beyond the first individual coming up with their home sign, but we introduce a community, there the sort of the other more language level pressures come in, which is the needs of the community itself to be able to communicate in an efficient way and start introducing all the things they want to communicate about, right? So as it's no longer just about your initial needs and the initial things you want to talk about, but it's about everyone being able to communicate about more and more things and more functions and so on. And then you have this external pressure to then start figuring out ways to make your language smaller so you can fit all the information you need to be able to fit.
Friedemann has a question waiting. Oh, you want to just add it?
What is it?
Friedemann, go ahead. And there's also another question from the attendees, but I don't see who it is. Est-ce qu'on peut constater ce qui c'est? Go ahead, Friedemann.
Right. Yeah, addressing this question about the language evolution, so to speak, in a population of children who cannot communicate otherwise. And I think it's indeed so that LLM creators are not interested in these issues. They have produced a product that sells, and they want to optimize it and sell an even better product. And their game at the moment is this task of adding words to sentence fragments or to and then building one more word after the other. But there is a literature on child language and language ontology where neural networks people have looked very closely into the possible mechanisms, and also in the psycholinguistic literature and language developmental literature with very serious network-based modeling, and not so large language models in this case, but there's a range of interesting developmental findings that could be modeled and reasonably explained. For example, I mentioned the case of Ellman already. Famously, there's also, for example, Kurt Westerman or or Angelo Cangelosi, who actually built the brain-like neuronal networks into robots and had those robots communicate. So there's also the link to communicative interaction. But this is not, I think, the focus of this conference. Therefore, I just wanted to mention it. It's not LLMs, but it's just SLMs, small language models that can do a good job here, in my view.
Just wanting to, I just want to add something to what Eva was saying about in response to Valerie. Well, first, I totally agree with Eva here. I agree that the Nicaraguan sign language situation is something obviously that no large language model has even started to address. But in some of the talks we saw in the last 2 days, I'm thinking of Richard Futrell's, Eva's, and Misha Belkin. We've had some beginnings of answers to those questions. Richard was talking about that when you learn a language, you try to minimize surprisal while keeping the expressivity constant. And that's, I would say, is one of the things that, unbeknownst to them, the children in Nicaragua were doing. They were evolving a language that respected these constraints and others that have been presented this morning by Eva, and that were even more generally presented yesterday by Misha. Those are constraints on the cultural evolution of a language, and I think that's what we saw. Maybe there were innate things in there in the infants, but there were also information-based constraints that the evolution of their language respected. That is, and these are things that the studies of large language models. And I'm speaking about large language models and not necessarily ChatGPT, which is, I agree, with a commercial product, and where both interests are confused, but just the large language models. And people who do study like that, both Richard and I think Eva did language that did study with GPT-2. So you don't need such a big large language model, and you don't need something as well that has been tailor-made to sell subscriptions for a company. But they were able to show that there were some general information-based constraints that govern language evolution in the community. And I think those are relevant to thinking about how the children in Nicaragua evolved their sign language.
I'm going to make one comment about that.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead, Virginia, but Rushan, get ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the principles that Futrell talked about was something that would rule out multiply embedded sentences. And I feel that we're simply debates that were had 40 years ago about sentences and grammars. So the point about grammars is that they produce things that people don't say, but cannot principally be removed from the production of the grammar. And multiply center embedded sentences do exist. And there are counterexamples to the claim that Futrell was making, and he acknowledged that he was just hand-waving about how he might be able to cope with them. So I think there's a lot of claim that isn't backed up by actual evidence. And it's easy to spin a story, but it's harder to get evidence that the story works.
Rushan, are you ready?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd like to check with everyone, especially the large language model, about my understanding of the differences between a human baby and a machine. There seem to be a number of differences that we've seen in the talks. And I'm thinking of the word large language model. It seems like the machine needs humongous amount of data to be trained to eventually, hopefully generate sentences like humans. But that's not something the babies have, even though in Virginia's talk, you've mentioned some studies where people show how many million words they hear. But if you test very young babies, I'm not sure if they get that much, right? We now have data that's echoing on what you presented with the tense part, with the verb, inflections, and auxiliary. We have data that's astonishing. We don't understand why 7, 8 months are generalizing to novel instances with very brief exposure to familiar auxiliaries and inflections in their language. We thought it's unbelievable. 14 months, definitely. And they show hierarchical structure. That's the other thing, that as soon as they are doing something, they show not linear, like next word thing that's spit out by the machine. So there's something fundamentally different from for humans and human babies. I'm not sure if they get that much exposure. You can wait for 5 years for them to do. That's usually how the database corpus work uses. But we've done artificial language paradigm that respect the prosody that Judith was talking about, and to see basic rudimentary phrase structure. 14 months old with 30 some exemplars, they're doing anchor words, function word kind of generalizations. So I think there's something about babies that are powerful and different from the machines. In a way, maybe not so powerful because we don't have that billions of words of utterances of memory. Maybe humans have evolved because we don't have that kind of memory and enormous storage, RAM computation with the machines. Then we develop expectations for hierarchical structures, and we have expectations for generalizations based some kind of predisposition. Of course, in the end, we will say, well, does the machine end up, after all that kind of next word training, spit out stuff like humans do? That's something else. It's useful, but it doesn't necessarily explain how humans, it seems humans, even when we see richness of the data, there's a lot of inconsistencies. And the way we do it, there's something predisposed for certain timetables like Judith has shown. And there's something that children are biased to track certain things and do certain, even their computation that are distributionally based are not purely linear. They do something with some kind of biases that could be considered maybe UG based. Anyway, I'd like to hear you guys about it. The large language model, I would be really impressed, which I'd like to see, is small language model. Can the machine learn like a baby with just this, in our case, even 8 items, 10 items? And when you have 16 items, some inconsistencies, they can do it. Well, can the machine do that, right? When 100% consistency, that's the most ideal, with a dozen, 2 dozen items, it seems so far ChatGPT and all these other models rely on, if I'm right, I don't know if I'm right, very large samples. No, very clean, nice samples. So I'd like to hear you guys' comments on that.
But out of fairness, it's not fair to ask only Eva. Eva is not ready to defend the stoutest of the comments, but go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I feel like this is a point that came up both in Virginia's talk and also Judith's talk about how it's not a fair comparison for us to consider these models at their final state, right? But it's language learning, and when we talk about these sort of experimental results with kids, these are like in the early stages of language acquisition, and really, not to say this is a fair comparison again, because that, large language models are not cognitive models in any way, but the closest, I would think actually the closest sort of comparison class in terms of people would be a group of people in this case, or at the very least an adult, right? And so the point you're sort of bringing up is one that is definitely just generally lacking in this field, which is to start thinking about, like, can we actually look at learning in these models throughout the learning process, right? Are they showing behaviors? Are they showing mistakes, as you pointed out, that are similar to kids early on when they're starting to be exposed to linguistic input, possibly grounded input? And that is really, I think that's just generally a field that is super interesting and doesn't have enough researchers right now, in part because of the fact that a lot of these models are closed class. At least large language models require very large amounts of resources to train. And so in terms of the academic community, we're definitely limited in the type of models that we can work with to try to ask these questions. And so, yeah, I totally agree. It's a super interesting place. We don't actually really know what the differences are early on because we are missing that research still on a lot of questions. We are missing the sort of probing of these models early on, looking at what they're doing initially when they're first starting to be exposed to linguistic input.
Okay, we're near the end, but I want to give the poor suffering audience a chance to say that you've not done for me what you were promising to do in the panel. Is anybody brave enough to come here and say, I didn't understand this, or I didn't see the connection between this and that? Or am I just imagining that you're perplexed? Could it be that the reason that there are fewer of you now than there were in the prior sessions, because this particular question of whether there's any relevance of linguistics and child learning to the things that made you interested in ChatGPT and the large language models, maybe you don't think there is any relevance a priori? Good, we've got somebody ready. Say your name if you dare.
Hi, I'm Felix. You talked a lot, the whole panel, about the importance of linguistic for mondialization, and that's kind of the big question for summer school. But as a linguist, I'd like to ask the opposite question, that what do model help us do in linguistics? And yeah, that's my question.
But whom is it addressed to? The trouble is.
Maybe the linguist first.
Oh, okay. I'm going to force Charles to answer.
I'll try. Neural technology has made a lot of the tools much better. I use corpus a lot. Very often you would like the data to be part of speech tagged. Neural taggers are much better than the statistical models back in the day. As Ava was saying, these technologies are thought provoking. It does ask us to re-examine our assumptions and our beliefs, and so it's not a bad thing. I think a lot of the skepticism comes from the day-to-day empirical work a lot of us do, and the distance between that and what these technologies can deliver, and also what the technologists have been over promising.
Okay, and Ronnie, you're not innocent of using some of it yourself too. What about you?
No, I think these are great tools, and I think they can help us in reasoning about how much information there is in a given corpus. So I'm just basically continuing things that Charles just mentioned, but we can use them to look at corpora and deal with these corpora, and that can be very helpful. We can use these models to ask what a neutral, more or less linguistically neutral learner would make of a given amount of information. We can then use that to re-examine all kinds of old arguments from the poverty of the stimulus, arguments from the richness of the stimulus, And so I think they're extremely useful tools. I also think that it's good that these models can be so confusing and that they make some people think that they're good models of cognition, even though they're not, just because it forces us to have these debates again. And I think it's healthy and for the field to have these debates every once in a while. I think many of these debates really were, we're just repeating things that were said many times over the past few decades, but I think it's good to remind ourselves of these things. So if the models can do that, then that's great. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know, Virginia, whether it's true that we're just reenacting the old debates. I think it's a different ballgame with ChatGPT and LLMs that can do these things. Let's not forget that those of us who are honest should admit that we were surprised that you could get that kind of performance out of an LLM. There will be people who have more pronounced positions than the ones in today's. The ones today were wonderful and learned, and everything they said was worth hearing. But there will be people with stronger views in the next few days. So this debate may repeat. I just want to say, Virginia, that you shouldn't be discouraged. When we first met in the SPP in the same debates, there was no ChatGPT to back up. There's just this vague Turing test that maybe someday some machine, whatever. Now we've got something that's almost that, and it's another ballgame. Thank you for coming today. Come again for the rest of the sessions, and I'm going to try to get them onto YouTube. Did you have anything else? Okay, thank you. Peux-tu couper l'enregistrement?
Bye.